Okay. Yeah. Thank you. 104b Kudal Beis. The line begins with the square brackets, which says V'holchu, the Batei and L'Shalom, and the next word is Ubachei Sifke Balayla. So we are continuing our analysis of Eicha, the book of Lamentations. We went through the first verse, and we explained it in details, the square brackets, and then right after that. We explained the first verse in detail, Eicha Yashu Badad, Ha'ira Basi'am, Ha'isa Kalmana. We went through all those details. What's the end of the verse? And then the next pasuk is Bachei Sifka Balayla. Cry, it cries at night. So it's a double expression describing Yerushalayim as crying at night. So we're going to analyze what the double expression of crying is, and then we'll talk about what it means at night. And then the rest of the verse, V'dimasah Lechya, it's tears are on its cheek. It has no comforter from all of its beloveds. All of its friends abandoned her; they became her enemies. That's the second verse. Okay, so beginning with Bachei Sifka Balayla, cry, she cries at night. Says the Gemara, this double expression of crying, lama, what's it for? Just Bachei Balayla, cried at night. Why Bachei Sifka, cry, it cries. Amar Rabbi Rabbi said in Rabbi Yechanan, one for the first destruction of the first base of Midrash, and one for the destruction of the second temple. Why is this a chiddush?
Didn't do it before.
It's in future.
Because the second base of Midrash hasn't been destroyed yet.
Right.
Eicha is written after the destruction of the first temple. Yes. So there's a kind of prophecy embedded in this thing, that there's going to be a second temple and also destruction there.
That's why Tif cares in the future.
Cry, it shall cry in future tense. Yeah, it's true. The second crying is in future tense. Then the Gemara says, Balayla, cries at night, and not during the day. So says the Gemara, Al Iske Laila, it's crying over an issue that happened at night. What's the issue that happened at night? Says the Gemara, Shenemar, as the verse reads. This is a reference to when the Jews went, when the Jews were in the desert, and the spies were sent to scout the land of Eretz Yisrael, and they came back and gave a negative report, and then they were told by Hashem, and they were told by Moshe Rabbeinu very sternly, very strongly, that this was a mistake, and that this generation is going to, you don't want to go into Eretz Yisrael, so that's what's going to happen. You're not going to go into Eretz Yisrael. And that generation, they wandered in the desert for 40 years, so that generation completely died of natural older age, and then the next generation went into Eretz Yisrael. So when they were told that information, says the verse like this: Vatisa kol ha'eda, the entire nation, the people raised up, and they all raised their voice, gave their voices, and cried that night. So the Bachei Sifka, the double crying of the first temple and the second temple, is Al Iske Laila, is over that which happened that night, a reference to the mistake that the spies made. And then the people crying as a result of that. So I'm going to conclude this, but then we'll give maybe a little deeper explanation. Amar Rabbi Yechanan, Rabbi said in Rabbi Yechanan, Oisai Laila, that night, when the Jews cried in the desert, Leil Tisha B'Av Haya, it was night of Tisha B'Av. It was the first event that happened on the 9th of Av. It was the mistake of the spies and the Jews being informed, or the spies returning with their mistaken report, and the Jews crying over that issue. It's on Tisha B'Av, 9th of Av. And Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, God tells the Jewish people, God tells the Jewish people, Ata b'chisam b'chis shalchinam, you guys cried in vain, meaning to say, it was by your own free choice you made the mistake, and therefore you're crying. So there's going to be a time when this day is going to become, for generations to come, a night of crying. So that's the Gemara here. So if you read, the Gemara is connecting three events: the crying of the spies, this first base of Mikdash and the second base of Mikdash. And if you read it's a drush, which means it's not a literal interpretation of the verse, it's a homiletic interpretation of the verse, so it doesn't have to always be perfectly exact. But if you take this drush and you match it on the pasuk, it's a little bit odd. Bachei Sifka Balayla, cries over the first base of Mikdash. Tifka shall cry over the second base of Mikdash. Balayla at night, because of the spies, I thought you just said it's crying because of the first and second base of Mikdash. All of a sudden now it's crying because something that happened. Obviously, these three events are interconnected, and moreover, the mistake of the spies leads to the destruction. As Hashem says, you cried freely because of a free choice mistake. I'm going to make it permanent, which means whatever problem is happening at the first base of Mikdash, at the issue with the spies, is happening again at the first and second base of Mikdash. And how is that? So perhaps we all know famously how Chassidus explains the mistake of the spies, that they didn't want to go into Eretz Yisrael because they knew that going to Eretz Yisrael meant they would have to work the land. Living in the desert with Hashem's protection, with the manna from heaven, with all the miracles, with Moshe Rabbeinu, they lived in spiritual bliss. And they preferred that spiritual bliss rather than going into the Eretz Yisrael, working the land, and half their day in the desert. Presumably a Jew could sit and learn Torah. What did they do a whole day? Listen to Moshe Rabbeinu preach and farbrengen and learn and daven.
It's comfortable in yeshiva.
It's very comfortable in yeshiva, yeah. But then Hashem says, go to Yisrael, I got to go out there. You got to work and plow. What's the pasuk says? You have to work. You have to work and plow to get your. That's by other Marishim. But there's a pasuk there also that you have to work the land yourself. And the Jews didn't want that. The spies didn't want that. And that was the mistake.
If they're worthy, though, it says the brachas parasocha says that they're working with others.
Sorry?
They work with acherim. It says they can be kukosai.
That's a very lofty level.
Yeah.
But the expectation was.
The ideal was if the Jews observed properly, they wouldn't have to work.
Yeah,
so hard.
but the Jews they didn't want to have to go through that test and issue.
But some said they want to go back to Mitzrayim. They want to go to other.
This is the Chassidish explanation.
Yeah, I mean, but the pshat is not
the Chassidish explanation is that they wanted to enjoy the spiritual excitement of the desert, the spiritual bliss of the desert.
Was that the spies or everyone? There's 3 million.
This is the spies' mistake, and people went along with it. It's very alluring.
They complained about the money doesn't taste this and that. So
Sorry?
Yeah, the pshat is different. Because they actually said they're figuring out down the desert. That was their concern.
Yeah.
They wanted to make study Torah. They said they're panicked because they said that the spies came back.
This is the Chassidish interpretation.
Some want to go back
Sorry?
to Mitzrayim. Some want to do what is Torah. I mean, they're different groups. Not all of them were.
that was like more in the beginning.
No, even at the spies too. They just go back to Mitzrayim.
Yisachar and Zavulun.
Yeah,
But even those who are learning them into support.
They all wanted to be in yeshiva. Some wanted to get out there and mix money.
So not all agree that.
They were. I guess the spy. Well, also even Yeshua and Kalev protested, right?
Yeah, they're two good spies.
So they didn't. So I'm assuming there were some Yidden who were like that also. Furthermore, the Alter Rebbe uses as an example of
Also
the fact
with
that every Jew has faith in
big
Hashem.
relations with the Avodah Zarah
What's his
allowed,
proof?
Torah is not allowed.
Because Moshe Rabbeinu didn't have to convince them I was wrong to the spies. As soon as he yelled at them, they automatically regretted. Why? Because as soon as that klippah was broken, they realized that deep down they already wanted to do what Hashem wants. Right? So it means even the Jews themselves somewhere want to do the right thing, but they made this mistake because it's very alluring. Anyway, so sorry. Anyway, there are places where Chassidus explains how to reconcile this with the pshat, but that's not the point for right now. There are places where it explains how this works with the pshat.
But others don't interpret that way. They interpret this according to the.
I think we already made our legal declaration, or not yet. Did I? Our legal declaration. This is one interpretation, and there are many more. This works now. Legal declaration for the rest of the year. Till next year, every 3 years, I think the halacha is. So for the next 3 years, I have to make a legal declaration, right? The chazak have to make it every 3 years.
Exactly.
Okay, so this is the Chassidish interpretation that the Yidden, the spies, wanted to rather stay in the desert where there is spiritual bliss. And of course, the ultimate objective is Hashem wants a dwelling place in this physical world. And Hashem wants to go to Yidden to Eretz Yisrael, and Hashem wants them to live in a natural way. I mean, even if they were going to get in B'chokos Telechu, it's left to be a natural.
Yeah, but
it's left to be in the natural.
Minimal effort. It
was left to be the natural way. Yeah. In the desert, it was not natural, which is also partially why they complain. Because when you're spoiled, you complain more than when you're not spoiled, even when you're spiritually spoiled. Anyway, there's a lot of places where it explains how we reconcile this idea with, or explain the whole pshat al pi this idea. But that's not the point for now. The point I'm making here is that the Chassidish mistake, according to Chassidus, the mistake was they want to stay in the desert and enjoy the spiritual bliss rather than going to Eretz Yisrael and work the land and make a dir b'tachton and turn this physical world into a dwelling place for Hashem that requires effort and engagement with the world outside. Even at the battle, and they were expected to battle not the same way they battled in leaving Egypt where God split the sea. Yeah, even though there was a splitting of the Yarden, but that's not how they battled. They had to fight. Even though there was miracles, but it wasn't the same way as explained in Chassidus at length. So what does that have to do with the destruction of the temple? Chassidus also explains that the destructions of the temple, each time the Beis Mikdash was destroyed, the level of spirituality was degraded. In fact, that's the truth of all generations. you get from the first Beis HaMikdash with the 10 miracles and the levels of prophecy, the second Beis HaMikdash where you have the Zugais and you have the Nisim, you had great leaders, even though they weren't prophets, but they were of serious stature. And then even when you get to Bavel, you still had a centralized Jewish authority with Nisim who did miracles, as you read in the stories in the Gemara. And you had people who wrote the Mishnah, the Gemara, and slowly the revelation of Hashem slowly gets diminished as the generations go on. But along with that comes the fact that the service of Hashem by the Jew in these times of lower revelation indicates a deeper connection. In that, even notwithstanding the fact there's less revelation, the Jew still gives his full service to Hashem. And that is ultimate Dira Tachtonim. The dwelling place below, the big condition is that this dwelling place, this making a home for Hashem, come not imposed from above, but rather from the realm of Tachtonim, from the realm of those down here. So the less revelation, as it were, the deeper the home is being made from below. And thus, with each Beis HaMikdash being destroyed, less revelation, yes, and therefore it's nighttime, it's Bachei Sifcha Balayla, they're crying at night, it's night as in there's no revelation from Hashem. But yet, at the same time, that indicates a deeper connection from the Jew going below to above rather than from above to below. And therefore the mistake of the spies and the destruction of the temple lead in the same sense, in that in each of these occasions, the revelation of Hashem is less, thus compelling the Jew to dig deeper in his connection to Hashem, making therefore the home that the Jew makes from below to above in a deeper sense, even though the revelation from above is higher. And that perhaps is the connection between these three events.
Or simple
explanation, not
flowing the will of Hashem.
Yeah,
that's simple.
But there's different ways in which it happens, but then you connect it.
Because they're different Averas, so by Rishon are 3 Averas, and by Sheni Sina.
See, with the beauty of what I'm sharing with you is with according to Chassidus, that doesn't negate this fact that they're all connected by sin. It just gives you a deeper underlying thread within that sin, not just Exile, sin, but rather there's a deeper kind of overarching trajectory of how history goes.
Actually, another combination of if they listened to their leaders, it wouldn't have happened. For example, Moshe Rabbeinu told the Gold.
All of this doesn't negate what I'm saying. On the contrary, I think that all reason.
If you do tshuva, the temple will remain. And by Shane, Rabbi Yochanan Zaken said, "Don't fight against Rome; too powerful." So all 3 cases of the rebellion against.
This is true of all of history, always. But there's always Chachamim who warn the Jew. But I don't think this is not a. It's not a. I'm saying is it's not another explanation that somehow contradicts one. They all within, and that's the beauty. And that's the beauty of when a person learns Chassidus. We talked about this a little bit yesterday about the oil. When you reveal a certain level of Torah, then all the details of Torah become interconnected because they share at one core root. Okay, and now this leads to the next few lines, which even though on the surface, as we'll see, is a description of something negative, but in some sense it has a positive silver lining. And I think the positive silver lining that we're going to see is that from below to above, there's a deeper connection to Hashem, as we shall see in the next few lines. Okay, so Davar Acher. The line begins with the word Adoris and Davar Acher. Davar Acher. Another way of understanding the word Balayla, at night. So the simple reading of the Gemara. The first interpretation of the word Balayla, at night, means that they were crying as the result of that which happened at night, namely when the Jews cried at night in the desert, as a result of the mistake of the spies. Another interpretation of the word Balayla, or again not contradictory, but another layer of meaning of the word Balayla, is anybody who cries at night, his voice is heard. The simple meaning is it's quieter at night. Rashi says, recites to a Gemara where daytime the sun has its effect on the sound, but even just on the pashtos, a very simple level, when someone cries at night, you hear it because there's less noise in the streets, there's less background noise. That's just the simple pshat. Connecting to what we just said before, when a person is calling out to Hashem, crying as it were during Beis HaMikdash time when there's revelation from above, so his voice is not so heard because he's just reacting to the revelation. But when a person's crying at night, when there's no revelation, now the cry is heard.
We say in davening, faith comes in the night.
That's right. That's true faith when a person's in nighttime. That's correct. So nighttime, not literally, nighttime as in Golos time, when there's no revelation from Hashem, that crying is heard.
It's obvious when things are going well, even in Buddha.
Which connects, continuing to what we said before.
When they
Sorry?
were crying, that they were the first, they were the highest level in the midbar. It wasn't like.
That's what I'm saying. But this is setting the precedent for the rest of exile. We're saying this Eicha till today. Yeah. As in our cry, which is at night, is heard in some sense deeper than the cries of those who are standing in the Beis Hamikdash and crying.
Sure, because our vote is hard.
Our vote is truly being heard. Because it's in a time.
The ones in the midbar, that's the highest level.
In some level, yes. In some way, yes.
They were higher.
So in one perspective, they were higher because the revelation was higher. Yeah, but their avodah wasn't as deep. Sure, and therefore at nighttime, when there's less revelation, Kaila Nishma has voices heard.
It's like from above to below and below to above.
And this is going to be similar in the next few lines. Davar Acha, another way of understanding the word Balayla, another layer of this. Balayla at night, Shekola B'Eicha Balayla, anybody who cries at night, Kaychav Mazolis B'Eichin Imay. The stars and the constellations in heaven cry with him. Meaning to say, okay, that's the literal level. No, as Rashi says, they have mercy on him, they have compassion on him. The stars and the constellations, literally. But more, perhaps we can say that because it's the cry at night, it's not a revelation from above to below it's an elevation from below to above. Therefore, it elevates with it all of reality. The true Dibur Tachtonim and elevating the physical world comes at nighttime, comes in the dark, and that our cry brings with it the cry of all of the universe. Elevation in the entire world. When it's below to above, when it's above to below, the world is overwhelmed. But when it's below to above, it elevates, and the cry comes from the world, from the night itself. The night itself is crying. The Kachav Mazoles, the stars in the constellation which are seen at night, the night itself, the Golus itself is crying, as it were. The Golus, the exile itself is being elevated and crying out. Likewise, Davarach, another layer of what it means by night, Balayla, at night, Shekola B'Eicha Balayla, anybody who cries at night, Hashem Maya Koilai, somebody else who hears that cry, B'Eicha Kenegdoi cries with him.
It's like
isn't it? But another human being, right. Another Jew. Yeah. So
they cry together.
Another sense like this. When the Jews are in the temple and there's revelation from above to below, one could see a situation, and this was the case in history, that each Jew is competing, as it were, to access for greater revelation. So one person's crying out to Hashem because he wants to connect. The other person sees it a competition and he starts crying also, but not in empathy, because he's trying to. They're all fighting, as it were, to get higher revelation because it's all there. They want to grab it. But when it comes at night, the unity amongst Jews, and that we're all crying together, we're all one, we're all in this together, is more seen and more felt in that exile. And when one Jew is crying, the other Jew is crying. And where does this come from? It comes from the tzaddik.
More unified.
That's correct. And that's the tzaddik, the Rebbe's job. Part of his job is to unify the Jews, and that they all cry out to Hashem together, as we'll see in the next story. Ma'aseh b'isha achas, the story with a woman. Shechemte shel Rabbi Gamliel, who was a neighbor of Rabbi Gamliel, this woman. Shemei Spina, her son died Nebach. And at night, this woman would cry. So she's crying on a lonely night. Who hears her? The tzaddik hears her. The Rebbe hears her. Shama Rabbi Gamliel. Rabbi Gamliel hears her cry. Kaila, her voice. Ubacha Kenegda, and he would cry with her. Even though they didn't necessarily meet. But he would hear her crying in the night. This lone voice crying. This lost yid in the middle of Gullus, in the middle of the night, is crying. And who hears the cry? The Rabbi Gamliel. Achen nashru risei einav. To the point that his eyelashes would start to, the way Rashi interprets it is his eyelashes were so worn out that they would start sticking to his eye. They would bend down and flop from wetness. And he couldn't sleep. Rabbi Gamliel couldn't sleep at night. He couldn't sleep hearing this woman cry. The next day, the students realized that Rabbi Gamliel wasn't sleeping and his eyes were all worn out, and they see his eyelashes are messed up from crying. And they removed her from his neighborhood because they wanted to give him better sleep. So perhaps it means something like this. In Golus time, like the Gemara said, when a person cries at night, when a Yid cries in Golus time, other Yidden feel that cry and they cry together with him. Specifically, who feels that? His Rebbe feels that. The Tzaddik feels that. Unless Chassidim deal with it. If Chassidim
take the person away.
Take the person away doesn't necessarily mean, the literal story is that they took her away. But it could mean that they took her out of her misery.
Yeah, she doesn't cry anymore.
If you take it to neshama, a Yid is crying not necessarily in the literal sense that she lost her children, but a Yid is crying, and that his neshama is crying and wants to connect to Hashem. because she lost her children. In Chassidus, we see that children is the mashal in Kabbalah is that the parents are understanding of Hashem, which give birth to emotions, feeling for Hashem. Right? So she's crying because she lost her children. She's crying because she's stuck in darkness and she doesn't have a love and fear of Hashem. She lost her children. As it were, the Yid is crying because they can't even feel Hashem. They can't even feel love and fear anymore. And over this, the Rebbe is crying that Yid doesn't feel his connection to Hashem. And that's why he has Chassidim, to go reach out to these Jews and not necessarily take her out of the neighborhood. That's a literal interpretation. But one might say, take her out of her misery, as it were.
Bring him in, yeah.
Take
him out of the misery.
The Rebbe doesn't have to cry over this lone Yid because the Chassidim are taking care of it. Perhaps. That's not the simple level. I'm taking it at a little. I translate the literal, then I'll take it to another. Sorry?
It's always like that here in Gemara.
The story seems more literal.
The story is literal.
Oh, it is literal.
I'm just adding another literal interpretation and following the line. Yeah, I'm just giving a Hasidic interpretation. Of course, the story remains literal and ein mikra yetziv de pshutai. Even when you give many explanations and they're all beautiful and nice, it's not here to replace the simple meaning. It's to add another dimension to the simple meaning, but not the.
But I think a simple explanation.
Can't tell you.
No, he wasn't crying for her. He's crying for the base of Mikdash. Her sadness
is a result of the base of Mikdash. It's the same thing.
Cries for her son. How he felt about the loss of Shechina.
But they're the same thing. It's the same thing. The loss of the Shechina is the cry of another Yid. They're not two separate things. They're not two separate things. A Yid suffering and the lack of Shechina in the world are not two separate issues. If someone sees them as two separate issues, they either don't know what it means to have a Yid suffering, or they don't know what it means that the Shechina is missing. They're one and the same issue to cry over. It's not separate issues. The Kabbalists in the times of the Exile in Tzfas used to wake up in the middle of the night and Chatzos, and what they're crying over? They're crying over the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash. Yeah. You read Eicha, or if you read Slichus on any of these days when we describe the Beis Hamikdash, half of it's about the Shechina and half of it's about Yidden suffering. Because they're not two separate issues. They're one and the same issue. They're one and the same issue. Yeah. There's one time especially, you probably remember this, when there's a woman in Karnait Nabach who was lynched. Quite literally lynched. Yeah. She was in her
was screaming about
Lapine, a woman. I mean,
they went into her house?
They went into her house and they did terrible things to her. I think even when this is in the 80s. Not even so. I know this. Her youngest son's a little older than me. He was a baby. I'm not sure. Anyway, I don't want to say too much of the story because I don't know all the details. But certainly, there's a video that I was speaking about it. It's in the 80s, and everyone was bawling about it. Pashit bawling. It's like hard to watch the video. They were crying. He's holding his words back from talking about the Shechina in pain and Yidden in pain and very, very borderline scary words. He holds himself back, says a half a sentence and stops. It's very, 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 very intense. It's even to watch the video is very intense, and it's what I imagine this looked like. Rabbi Gamliel crying over a neighbor who's suffering to the point that his eyelashes are getting ruined.
Did they get the police to investigate?
I don't know I don't know what the story was. I don't know where this guy is today. I'm not sure. You don't remember the story? If the guy's in jail, I have no idea. But I know the name. I know the bacher. The boy's the son's my friend. The youngest son's is a friend of mine. We were in shlichus together in Australia. Anyway, good Erev Shabbos, everybody.
Thank you.
It's quite a powerful Gemara here about both the nature of exile, and both being a very sad, dark time, but I don't want to say the potential, but the avodah, the work that we have to put in Golos, in the stars and bringing the stars and the moon, bringing all of nature with us, and it begins with the Rabbi Gamliel, the Rebbe, who helps us understand, obviously, Yisrael and empathy and hearing another Yid's cry. So since we just came from the Alter Rebbe's Yahrzeit, the famous story, let's conclude with this because it's a nice story related to this. Right, the famous story of the Alter Rebbe was sitting upstairs and learning.
Oh, the baby crying.
And his son, the Mittler Rebbe, who later became the second Rebbe, was learning downstairs. And the Mittler Rebbe's child fell off the bed and started crying. And the Mittler Rebbe, the second Chabad Rebbe, was so engrossed in learning, he didn't hear it. But the Alter Rebbe, the grandfather, heard it, came downstairs, and soothed the baby, and he told his son that when a Yiddish child is crying at night, you have to hear it.
Even if you're...
And it's not a contradiction to learning. That is the natural result of true learning. That's what the Rebbe teaches. Not just teaches in the theory, but teaches that a person should feel this way and feel that responsibility for other Yidden. A good Ner Shabbos, everybody.